there's a very simple truth that most men overlook. How you feel every morning isn't a matter of willpower, it's the result of how your biological system is functioning. If you have to drag yourself out of bed, feel mentally foggy, rely on coffee just to wake up, and then crash in the afternoon, that's not normal. That's a sign your system is dysregulated. But because it happens gradually, you get used to it and start believing it's your default state. So you begin trying to fix things from the outside, working out more, taking supplements, optimizing sleep, pushing yourself to be more disciplined, but the results remain inconsistent. Some days feel good, others don't. Motivation comes and goes, and you start to think the problem is that you're not trying hard enough. But that's not the truth. The real issue lies in how your body processes signals, specifically hormones. Testosterone isn't something you just boost and everything falls into place. It functions as a signal, and if the system receiving that signal is disrupted, then even with normal testosterone levels, you won't feel its benefits. Now look at how you eat throughout the day: breakfast, snacks, lunch, more snacks, dinner, sometimes eating even when you're not hungry, just out of habit. This creates something most people never notice. Your insulin levels almost never drop. Every time you eat, insulin rises, and when that happens continuously throughout the day, insulin stops being a temporary response and becomes your baseline. Insulin itself isn't bad, but when it stays elevated, it begins interfering with other systems, especially your hormonal system. It's like static in a phone call. The signal is still being sent, but it's unclear. Your brain is still signaling your testes to produce testosterone, but the message becomes distorted, not strong enough, not clear enough, and the result is that you don't experience the proper effects of that hormone. This is why many people get tested and are told their levels are normal, yet they don't feel normal. They're still tired, still unmotivated, still lacking sharpness, and they don't understand why. The problem isn't a lack of hormones, but a lack of sensitivity to them. And this is where intermittent fasting begins to make sense, not because it's magical, but because it creates space, a window where you stop introducing new signals into the system. When you stop eating, insulin begins to fall, and when it stays low long enough, the noise starts to fade. The system can finally hear clearly again. But there's something important most people go through and misunderstand. In the beginning, when you start fasting, you'll often feel worse. Energy drops, mood declines, libido decreases. It can feel like you're doing something wrong. And many people quit at this stage because they assume the method isn't working for them. In reality, that's not the outcome, it's the response. When you suddenly change the way you eat, your body doesn't interpret it as a conscious choice, it interprets it as a lack of food. And biologically, a lack of food equals danger. So your nervous system reacts by increasing cortisol, heightening alertness, and prioritizing survival. When cortisol rises, testosterone has to decrease. Because these systems operate in opposition, the body cannot prioritize survival and growth at the same time. That's why you feel worse in the beginning, not because your hormones are broken, but because your body is shifting modes. This is where many people give up, thinking it's a sign of failure, when in fact, it's a sign the process has begun. If you think logically, any system needs time to adapt when conditions change, and your body is no different. Once it realizes you're not starving, that food still returns consistently, just not constantly. It begins to reduce the stress response. Cortisol drops, and the system starts functioning differently. The key is getting through this transition phase, because if you quit halfway, you only experience the hardest part without ever reaching the benefits. But here's the part very few people tell you directly. That uncomfortable feeling is not a sign that you should stop. It's a sign that your body is being forced to change a way of operating it has been used to for years. It's like someone who has never run before. On their first run, they feel out of breath, heavy, uncomfortable, not because running is wrong, but because the body hasn't adapted yet. And if they stop at that first attempt, they'll believe forever that running isn't for me, when in reality, they simply didn't go far enough for their body to change. Fasting works the same way. In the early days, you're not just dealing with hunger, you're facing a long misaligned biological system trying to rebalance itself, and that process isn't smooth. There's friction, there's discomfort, but that friction is exactly what creates change. As insulin begins to drop, your body is forced to look for another energy source, and this is where many people misunderstand things. They think energy only comes from their most recent meal, but in reality, your body already holds a massive reserve of energy stored as fat. The issue isn't whether you have energy, it's whether you can access it. And if you've been eating constantly for years, your body has almost forgotten how to use that stored energy. It's like a switch that hasn't been used for a long time. When you turn it back on, it doesn't work smoothly right away. That's why you feel weak in the beginning, not because you lack energy, but because your fuel switching system hasn't adapted yet. And if you look at it correctly, this isn't a weakness. It's a sign that you're reactivating a built-in survival mechanism that you simply haven't used before. Once you move past this phase, something very different begins to emerge, not explosive energy, but stability. You no longer feel constant ups and downs, you don't need to eat the moment you feel slightly hungry, and you can focus for longer periods without distraction. This is when many people realize that what they were lacking before wasn't food, but the ability to use energy flexibly. This is the turning point when your body understands it doesn't need to rely on constant eating to function. It starts reducing stress signals, cortisol drops, and when cortisol drops, testosterone has room to return. But what's interesting is that the biggest change isn't necessarily that you produce more testosterone, it's that your body starts using it more effectively. Because when insulin is no longer chronically elevated, androgen receptors, the sites where testosterone binds to exert its effects, begin to regain sensitivity. Before, they were numb from too much noise. It's like being in an environment that's too loud, you gradually lose the ability to hear clearly. But when the noise disappears, you don't need louder sound, you just need quiet to hear again. That's why many people, after a few weeks of fasting, say they feel completely different even if their lab results don't change much. They're more focused, more decisive, their energy is more stable, and most importantly, they feel like they've come back. Not a better version, but the version that had been buried before. At the same time, another system begins to ramp up, growth hormone. When you go without food for a long enough period, this hormone increases significantly. Its role isn't to make you bigger overnight, but to protect muscle, support fat utilization for fuel, and enhance recovery. This directly contradicts the common fear that fasting causes muscle loss. In reality, your body isn't stupid. It won't destroy its most valuable tissue while stored energy is still available. It prioritizes using less essential resources first, which is why what you lose in the early phase is mostly water and glycogen, not muscle. And as you lose fat, especially around the abdomen, you're also removing a silent factor that suppresses testosterone, the enzyme aromatase, which converts testosterone into estrogen. The more body fat you carry, the more active this process becomes, and the more you lose your hormonal advantage without even realizing it. So when you reduce fat through improved metabolism, you're not just improving your appearance, you're directly improving your hormonal system. And at a certain point, you'll notice something you never expected before. Hunger is no longer something to fear. It's no longer an urgent signal that forces you to eat immediately. It becomes a normal signal that comes and goes, something you can observe without being controlled by it. This is a profound shift, not just physiologically, but psychologically. Because when you stop reacting instantly to every discomfort, you begin to gain control over your behavior. And that control doesn't come from force, it comes from the fact that your system has finally stabilized again. And this is the point where many people realize something they had never considered before. The hunger they've always feared isn't as dangerous as they thought. In the past, every time you felt hungry, your reflex was to eat immediately. You treated it like an emergency signal, as if not eating would cause your body to crash, lose muscle, or become exhausted. But once you move through the adaptation phase, you begin to notice something very different. Hunger comes in waves. It rises, peaks, and then fades on its own even if you don't eat. And after experiencing this enough times, you start to understand that your body is not as fragile as you once believed. It doesn't need to be rescued every few hours. It's simply sending signals, and you can choose whether to respond or not. This isn't theory. It's a real experience that anyone who goes far enough in this process will recognize. And that experience changes how you see yourself. You're no longer controlled by temporary sensations. You no longer have to negotiate with yourself every time you open the fridge. You begin to create a gap between signal and action, and that gap is where self-control is formed. What's interesting is that this shift doesn't require you to try harder. It happens when your internal system becomes more stable. When insulin no longer spikes constantly, when your energy is no longer tied to your most recent meal, you're no longer dragged up and down by peaks and crashes. You begin to operate on a different rhythm, slower, but more stable. And that's when you realize what you're building isn't just a diet, but a capability. The ability to switch fuels, to function without constant dependence, to maintain focus without continuous stimulation. This is what biology calls metabolic flexibility, a state where your body can use glucose when it's available and fat when it's not, without stress, without panic, without energy crashes. And if you look further ahead, you'll see that the value of this isn't just in a few weeks or months, but in the years to come, because most of the decline we see in men as they age doesn't happen suddenly, it accumulates. It starts with a system that becomes less flexible, more dependent, requiring more conditions just to function normally, and eventually, even a small disruption is enough to throw everything off. But when you build this flexibility, you're no longer that fragile. You can skip a meal without panic, change your routine without losing energy, and maintain stability even when your environment isn't perfect. That's a massive advantage that few people recognize until they experience it. And this is where a critical shift happens in how you view discipline. Before, you thought discipline meant forcing yourself to do uncomfortable things, pushing against your own impulses. But when your system is functioning properly, discipline is no longer force. It becomes a natural outcome of a system that is no longer disrupted. You don't have to fight yourself to avoid snacking. You don't need to rely on willpower to stay focused. These things become easier when your internal signals are clear. And that's when you realize something simple but often overlooked. The problem was never that you lacked willpower. The problem was that you were trying to run a disrupted system using willpower. And that's a battle you can't win long term. When you remove the noise, everything becomes lighter, clearer, and more sustainable. If there's one thing to take away from all of this, it's this. You don't need to become a more disciplined version of yourself. You need a system that functions properly, because when the system is right, behavior adjusts automatically, and that's what creates lasting change. And as you go deeper into this phase, there's a very distinct shift that you won't confuse with anything else, the way your brain starts to function. Before, your focus depended on stimulation, coffee, sugar, mood, bursts of inspiration. But now it begins to appear more consistently, without force, without needing to get into the mood. You simply sit down and work. And this isn't psychological, it's biological. When you fast, your body increases norepinephrine and dopamine in a way that's very different from constant eating. It doesn't create sharp peaks followed by crashes, it creates a sustained state of focus. This is what many people describe as hunter mode, not aggressive, not frantic, but a clean, directed form of alertness. You see problems more clearly, make decisions faster, and get distracted less. And if you think about it, this makes perfect evolutionary sense. Our ancestors couldn't hunt effectively if they were tired and mentally foggy. When hungry, they had to become sharper in a fasted state. That mechanism is still within you, you've just never activated it properly. While your brain is changing, another process is happening at the cellular level, one you can't see, but whose effects are very real: autophagy. This is a mechanism where the body begins to clean up when you go without food long enough. But it's important to clarify to avoid misunderstanding. Autophagy isn't your body eating itself in a destructive way. It's more like a cleanup crew moving through your cells, identifying damaged components, misfolded proteins, and inefficient structures, and recycling them. This is how your body optimizes itself, not by breaking down, but by upgrading. And that's why this process is considered one of the most important mechanisms for long-term health. It also explains a common misconception: people fear that fasting will cause muscle loss. But if you look at it correctly, muscle is one of the most expensive and valuable tissues biologically. Your body doesn't rush to destroy it when stored energy is still available. Instead, it prioritizes fat and less efficient components first. And the rise in growth hormone during fasting further reinforces the protection of lean mass. So if you're training and consuming enough protein during your eating window, you're not just preserving muscle, you're improving its quality. As you begin to lose fat, especially visceral fat, you're also shifting a critical factor in your hormonal system that most people overlook: the enzyme aromatase, which converts testosterone into estrogen. The more fat you carry, the more active this process becomes, and it happens silently, without obvious signs, until you start feeling the decline. So, when you reduce fat through improved metabolism, you're not just getting leaner, you're directly changing how your hormones function in your body. Another factor that improves is blood circulation. When insulin is no longer chronically elevated, endothelial function improves, nitric oxide production becomes more efficient, blood vessels dilate better, and this directly impacts physical performance, focus, and even more sensitive areas that people don't always talk about but care deeply about. But none of this is the most important part. The most important change is how you begin to interact with the world. Before, you reacted quickly to everything hungry. You ate, tired, you sought stimulation, bored, you reached for your phone. Your actions were almost entirely reflexive, but when your system stabilizes, you gain a pause between sensation and action, and that pause changes everything. You begin to choose instead of react. You begin to control instead of being pulled. And this doesn't come from being stronger, it comes from your system no longer being disrupted. If you sustain this state over time, you'll start to see the difference, not just in the present, but in the future. Because most men don't decline in a single moment, they decline gradually, year by year. Energy drops, fat increases, hormones shift, and they assume it's inevitable. But in reality, much of that decline is tied to a loss of flexibility. They become dependent on constant eating, constant stimulation, perfect conditions just to feel okay. And when those conditions aren't met, they fall apart. In contrast, when you build metabolic flexibility, you become a system that adapts. You don't need everything to be perfect to function well. You can skip meals, adjust your routine, handle stress without collapsing. And that's a massive advantage in real life. At this point, the question is no longer whether you should fast or not, it's what kind of system you want to build, dependent or flexible, reactive or intentional. And if you look 10 or 20 years ahead, the difference becomes even clearer. One path leads to gradual decline, low energy, dependence on substances, routines, and stimulation. The other leads to stability, not constant peaks, but a strong baseline, less fluctuation, less dependence. And that is what ultimately determines long-term quality of life. And one final thing to understand. Fasting is not the goal, it's a tool. The goal is to build a system that can function well under a wide range of conditions. And to do that, you need both states, eating and not eating, stimulation and rest, stress and recovery. It's the oscillation that creates adaptation, not extremes on either side. If there's one idea to take from all of this, it's this. You don't need to optimize everything you need to remove what's preventing your body from functioning properly. Because when the system works, many of the problems you're trying to fix will resolve on their own, without force. And if you've been stuck in a state of fatigue, low motivation, and unclear causes, the issue may not be you, but the way your system has been operating for a very long time. And the good news is, that can change not by trying harder, but by understanding better and realigning your biology.